Turn off the lights and answer this question honestly. If a society only pretends to believe out of fear, is it truly faithful or simply performing? On paper, much of the Muslim world appears nearly homogeneous. The numbers suggest unity, certainty, conviction. But behind closed doors, something quieter is unfolding. In Iran, mosques stand increasingly empty. In Tunisia, growing numbers of young people are drifting away from organized religion. Beneath the surface statistics, observers describe what may be one of the most significant silent shifts in modern religious history. How did regimes that claim to speak in the name of God preside over a moment where faith itself appears to be under strain? Is this a crisis of belief or a crisis of authority? This documentary explores the tension between power, fear, identity, and faith in the modern era. Let's set emotions aside and look at the data. According to Pew Research, the officially recorded rate of leaving Islam remains below 1%. On paper, religious affiliation appears remarkably stable. But in states where data transparency is limited, surveys often measure survival instinct rather than conviction. Anonymous and encrypted surveys conducted by GAMAAN suggest a different picture. In Iran, only 32% of respondents identify as Shia Muslim. Nearly half report that they have lost their religious faith altogether. Arab Barometer data points in a similar direction. In 2013, 8% of respondents described themselves as not religious. By 2019, that figure had risen to 18%. In parts of North Africa, the number exceeds 30% among younger generations. This is not a marginal fringe. It is a demographic shift involving millions, a slow structural tremor beneath the surface of official statistics. So why now? The answer may be simple and destabilizing: institutional fusion. For centuries, religion functioned primarily as a personal spiritual refuge. But over the past 4 decades, particularly after the 1979 Iranian Revolution, religion and state power became deeply intertwined in parts of the region. When the state becomes associated with corruption, religion absorbs the reputational cost. When the economy falters, public frustration often extends beyond policy and toward the moral authority intertwined with it. For many young Iranians or Saudis, religion is no longer perceived solely as a spiritual compass. It is increasingly experienced as a regulatory framework, shaping dress, media consumption, speech, and social behavior. When leaders who govern in the name of God are seen living in privilege while preaching sacrifice, legitimacy erodes. This dynamic creates a structural paradox. The closer religious authority fuses with political power, the more vulnerable it becomes to political failure. Some analysts argue that this is the self-undermining mechanism of modern theocracy, where institutional overreach gradually weakens the very belief system it seeks to defend. One of the most critical testing grounds of this shift is Turkey. Over the past 2 decades, an ambitious social engineering project aimed at raising a religious generation reshaped education policy, public discourse, and cultural life. The outcome, however, appears more complex than intended. While the number of Imam Hatip religious schools expanded significantly, surveys and youth studies indicate a parallel rise in deism and atheism, reaching some of the highest levels recorded in the history of the Republic. Many young people are not necessarily rejecting faith itself. They are rejecting a version of it they perceive as institutionalized, politicized, or imposed. Turkey did not simply follow Iran's model. Instead, it illustrates a similar structural dynamic. When belief is heavily enforced through political and educational systems, resistance can grow rather than diminish. This pattern has broader implications for political movements across the region. Slogans such as "Islam is the solution," long associated with movements like the Muslim Brotherhood, now face a generation primarily concerned with economic mobility, personal freedom, and institutional transparency. For Generation Z, identity politics alone is no longer sufficient currency. As political expectations shift, religion appears to be losing some of its leverage as a mobilizing force. particularly when intertwined with state authority. Scenario 1. The optimistic outcome, a European-style reformation. This silent shift could pave the way for a nonviolent transformation within parts of the Muslim world. If religion gradually disentangles from state authority and returns to the sphere of individual conscience, it may create space for more democratic, pluralistic, and secular political systems. Such a transition would not necessarily signal the end of faith. Rather, it could mark its depoliticization, a movement away from institutional control and toward personal conviction. In this scenario, belief does not disappear. It becomes civilian again, not an instrument of governance, but a matter of conscience. Scenario 2. The pessimistic outcome, radical inward retrenchment. When regimes begin to lose moral legitimacy, they often respond not with reform, but with consolidation. Control tightens. Surveillance expands. Moral enforcement mechanisms grow stronger. Authorities may broaden the powers of so-called morality police, while digital firewalls and information controls deepen isolation from the outside world. The result can be a divided society, a largely secular or disillusioned majority operating quietly beneath the surface, and a smaller but highly organized ideological minority enforcing orthodoxy in public life. Such polarization creates long-term instability. In this scenario, tension does not explode immediately, it simmers. It manifests as recurring unrest, cycles of protest and repression, and a persistent internal fracture. The risk is not simply political stagnation, but structural volatility, the kind that can evolve into chronic internal conflict. Scenario 3. The neutral path, the hypocrisy trap. In this outcome, regimes do not collapse, but neither do they meaningfully reform. The system endures. The rhetoric remains. Public rituals continue. Yet beneath the surface, little truly changes. Millions attend Friday prayers in public conformity, while privately living different realities, whether through quiet dissent, alternative lifestyles, or anonymous online spaces where doubts can be expressed without consequence. A generation learns not to rebel, but to perform. Over time, this dual existence erodes social trust. Institutions say one thing. Citizens practice another. The result is neither fully religious nor fully modern, but suspended between identities. Not open conflict, not renewal, but stagnation. A state structure that survives, yet remains internally fractured. Conclusion. History has shown us one enduring truth. Ideas cannot be imprisoned. The digital age has fractured the monopoly over knowledge once held by religious and political authorities. Today, a young person no longer turns exclusively to a cleric. For answers, they turn to a search engine. And the internet does not filter responses through ideology alone. It exposes contradictions. It connects doubts. It globalizes questions. This transformation is structural and difficult to reverse. As long as belief remains institutionally fused with political power, every failure of governance risks becoming a failure of faith in the public imagination. When religion is enforced, it is no longer chosen. And when it is no longer chosen, it gradually loses moral authority. Compulsion may produce conformity, but it rarely produces conviction. Because history suggests a simple principle: faith imposed is faith weakened.